Hi, Matt. Man, you're such an atheist. Sorry to tell you. No, seriously, thank you. Thanks a lot for taking the time and responding. I hope I can contribute something here. I'm not sure I can tell you anything you don't know already, but at least, yeah, I can share some of my experience. And I'll focus more on concrete experiences because I think we use terms very differently depending on where we're coming from, and it might help to actually figure out what we mean by those terms. Let's take the notion of atheism. So I was a bit surprised that you took this to be polemic because I don't mean atheism in a negative way at all. I actually wanted to achieve the exact opposite, to open up um, and show how there can be so many different meaning attitudes behind a term that otherwise is in our communities uh, a bit problematic, the notion of atheism. And there can be so many meaningful individual attitudes towards specific problems and questions within that term that it is possible to cooperate with people who define themselves as atheists, like, for example, Sam Harris or Harari. What I had in the back of my mind again was the example that people like John Verwicki or Zach Stein and what was the rabbi's name, Mark Guffney, from all the people they could pick out as enemies out there in the world, they picked out two of the people who are closest to their own worldview. From all, I think they're among the maybe top 5% of people who are as close to you as can be, which is like Sam Harris and Harari. In other words, Verwicki and Zach Stein and Mark Gaffney themselves did some kind of categorization thing where based on their categorizations, like for example, the propositional attitude with John Verwicki and with Mark and with Zach, the notion around eros and the meaning of narrative, where they experienced people to be enemies who actually are largely on the important issues on their side. So when I'm calling you an atheist, what I mean, and when I'm saying I'm not an essentialist in this context, what I mean is that even abstract terms like atheism, I don't believe have a single essence. They're not a thing, but they depend on the perspective looking, right? The perspective that has its own knowledge interests, looking at the world, is not just confronted with things, but it is confronted with something much closer to what Wittgenstein called the family resemblance issue. So depending on your perspective, what atheism actually is will be different. And if your perspective is the conventional Christian standpoint, then take the question of the afterlife, for example. Verwicki has been making this point. The conventional Christian conception of the afterlife is a very prolonged living experience, right? So the idea is that you're kind of reborn. So you're born again into your own body. It's not somebody else's body, it's your body. It doesn't miss a limb. You have all your hands, you have all your feet, right? You're not missing a nose or a ear. No, you have a fully embodied existence. You have your memories. It will suck if you forgot who you are, in the previous life. That would not cool. And then not only are you there, but your friends and family and so on, they're also embodied. They're not missing a limb. It would be stupid if the friends and people you love were missing their limbs and they were just lying around. Right? Not cool. So the picture here is that you spend time together with the best possible version of yourself, right? So you're, I guess, in your 30s or 40s, you're healthy, and yada, yada, yada. And Verwicki has been pointing out, look, if this is your conception of the afterlife, that's a nightmare. That's hell. And there was this popular movie, The Good Place, I think it was called, which made this point pretty well, that not only would this get boring, and you can delve into that, just imagine yourself to have this kind of life. This is all it takes for you to figure out this is not something you really, really want. And the point that Verwicki has been making is that if this is your conception of the afterlife, the very moment of experience when you share a moment with somebody else becomes devalued, it becomes meaningless. Relevance realization collapses. Nothing can be relevant in this. A similar point Heidegger's been making, without the finitude of human existence, the moment itself, the present experience itself becomes meaningless. The being directed towards death, towards finitude, is an essential part of the human experience and the necessary part for the human experience for it to have any sense of beauty and meaning at all. Yeah. So now looking at that, coming from the conventional Christian perspective, is someone who rejects this notion of the afterlife. Like, for example, John Vervaeke does. He says that's the wrong question. I'm not interested in this kind of afterlife. Is he someone who is more like an atheist? Or is he someone more like a conventional Christian? And it's very obvious. He's much closer to those who would totally reject faith as a whole, but intuitively, by doing that, also would reject the notion of afterlife as being something meaningful. And this is what you oftentimes hear people who are secular say. They say, well, no, I'm focusing on the present day experience because this is something I can know about. I can't really know about the afterlife. They, in a sense, have the right intuition that this conception is not something that really matters in their life. So from this perspective, from the conventional Christian perspective, John Vervaeke in this regard is more like an atheist than he is like a traditional Christian. So you see, we're breaking this relatively rigid term, atheist, down into very specific attitudes that you can have towards specific challenges and questions, and those looked at from a specific perspective, right? Take a different example. Take the, the relevance of consciousness. So in the hermeneutic tradition, like Schleiermacher, yada, 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 or even Rousseau had this insight, right? One of the basic insights is that what you bring to the table, this is what you bring to the text, already predetermines what you will take out of the text, right? What the text will be possibly meaning to you. So in other words, your pre-understanding in the God-Amorian sense, right? The horizon of pre-understanding and distinctions that you've already made as a person, which you bring to the table when you read and open a religious and spiritual scripture, already make a difference in how you will understand and interpret this religious spiritual scripture, right? Now, the conventional view, on the other hand, of the conventional Christian, typically is that the scripture is self-standing. So it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what your preconditioning, your culture that you're bringing to the table. Independently of those, you will get the same meaning if your heart is open to it, right? Now compare those, again, from the conventional Christian perspective, the idea that texts are always constructs that make sense only within pretextual, if you want, suppositions of a culture and of an individual's attitude and understanding. From a conventional Christian's perspective, that's putting the Bible down to just being a mere text, right? To being something that's open to interpretation. Conventional Christians would reject that. You can't just randomly come up with just random concepts of what, for example, the resurrection means, because the text tells you what it means, right? So someone like, again, John Vervaeke, and I assume you again, I think, and me in any case, right, when I'm approaching those texts, I'm brutally aware that my pre-understanding to a certain degree will determine what I'll be able to take out of those texts. So I'm very careful with what I bring to the text. I'm very careful with what distinctions I'm already capable to make. So when I'm not understanding a text, what I usually tend to do is I leave the text aside and start thinking about the matter at hand that the text is speaking about without looking at the text. And I try to figure out the subject at hand as differentiated as I can before even looking at how does the text actually conceptualize it. Then with having a differentiated understanding of the issue itself, I go back to the text. Because this is my, for example, heuristic tool, which I use, assuming simply that if the text is right about the matter at hand, then I as well should be able to, by looking at the matter at hand, understand the text, right? So if the text is right and has a point to make, by just looking at the matter at hand, I should actually be able to trace that back. Now, you might have a different approach, but in any case, for Christians, this is unacceptable. For conventional Christians, this is absolutely unacceptable. This is an atheist's position, again, from this vantage point of the conventional Christian. So from the conventional Christian's perspective, the Bible is not just literature, right? It has a very different standing. Or take another example, which is the distinction between God and the world. In the conventional Christian view, God is not the world. God is not nature, right? God is a being that has its own will, it has its own knowledge of the world, it has its own agency. It's not just the sum of all beings and the manifestation of all beings that we're encountering. And in this vein, Jesus has a very special standing. Jesus is not just one guy among many. He's special. He's God, and only he is God. You have that dualism between God and the world, and that special status of Jesus, right? Well, of course, the more esoteric traditions might make the point, well, Jesus was actually born Jesus. He wasn't born Christ. He had to become Christ. Because Christ consciousness is one, and everybody is capable of being induced into Christ consciousness, to manifest Christ consciousness, if you want, every single person. And Jesus was the body, the person, who was born without Christ consciousness. He had to go through suffering, through a process of development, of self-insight, to actually become God. This is a totally foreign conception for most conventional Christians. Tell a conventional Christian that Jesus wasn't born God, and they will look at it and say, what are you talking about, mate? This is totally foreign to conventional Christianity. And then you might point out and say, well, look, but then you don't know your own tradition, your own Christian tradition. Look at the sources. Look at the different interpretations that were out there in the beginning, and you'll figure out this is not only a perfectly valid interpretation of the whole picture, but it might even be the most consistent ones with what even Jesus had in mind in the first place. I'm not sure this is the case, but you could make the point. That's fine. But still, from the perspective of the conventional Christian, this is a form of blasphemy. This is an attitude which is more close to being an atheist position than to their position. Okay, so we could come up with so many more such examples. The only thing I would want to point out so far is that those distinctions are important. They matter. And now I'm primed in integral theory, so I perceive everything through integral theory. Sorry for that, but that's my worldview. And from an integral perspective, integration and transcendence is only possible where differentiation has happened. So where no differentiation is there, no distinction is there, even the idea to bring something together doesn't even make sense. You need to have that polarity. You have to have these, if you want, different categories and distinctions. You have to have individuation before you can have anything like transcendence. And the transcendence is not making everything equal, but it's maintaining that polarity and that diversity in something that is bigger than the individual standpoints. And this for me is crucial. These standpoints have to be differentiated as being different from each other. And let me give you an example where I think this never really happened and it had catastrophic consequences. It's almost always the case when we're talking about things with catastrophic consequences. Jordan Peterson comes to mind. So Jordan Peterson has been asked multiple times whether he believes in God, and his responses were always in terms of, but what do you mean by God? What do you mean by belief? Yada, yada, yada. So conventional Christians never could really make sense of that, and we're like, what? Now, you can make the point, yeah, Peterson is in a sense right, because belief, as conventional Christians take it, which is opinion, to strongly hold something to be true. It's a propositional attitude for conventional Christians. This is not the way belief typically was defined. And if you look at the literature, you figure out, wait a minute, faith, fides, contrary to opinio, is not a propositional attitude. It's not a way of relating something to something else, like in the Aristotelian sense, right? Where you say something about something else. So when you say, I believe in God, a propositional attitude will be, I believe, I literally think there is a thing, I have an image of something existing that has those specific properties, like being all loving, all knowing, and yada, yada, yada. That's a propositional attitude. This form of belief has, of course, by mystics been rejected as making yourself an image of God, which is already a form of, it's a form of rejecting God. It's actually atheism, if you want. From the perspective of the mystic, this perspective, this propositional attitudes towards God is atheist. It's rejecting the proper relationship to God. And technically, yeah, Peterson is right. Yeah, belief is not self-explanatory, and particularly the way we usually in conventional Christianity use the term, it is actually totally disconnected from its roots. So technically he's right about that. But on the other hand, Alex O'Connor was actually hitting the nail on the head when we were saying, but you can't tell me you don't understand what people are asking you for when they are asking you, do you believe in God? And why do you then simply not say, well, I don't. I don't accept this kind of image for those and those reasons. I have a different conception. I have a different God image, if you want. and it's non-propositional, yada yada yada, blah blah blah. So why don't you just say it? And it was only after so much trying, experimenting. So Alex came up with this example where he asked Jordan Peterson, well, if I had, at the time when Jesus died, someone was there with a Panasonic camera and recorded the tomb, did the camera record something when he resurrected or not? Right? He had to reformulate it in this weird way for the first time to Jordan Peterson to actually say, well, I think he said, I assume it recorded something on those lines. And conventional Christians are like, what? Like, why don't you just straight out say whether you actually believe that Jesus became flesh again and was a person that was recorded by the video camera, or just say you have some special interpretation of that and you think it's just an image or whatever, and say that. And now it is confusing, I think, for all parties involved what's happening here. For conventional Christians, it's confusing because they have a very specific question that they're asking and they're not getting an answer to that. On the other hand, I can understand Peterson when he's saying, well, I don't want to respond to that because I understand that what you want from me is to basically tell you what I'm part of your gang. And I don't do gang games, right? I'm not this kind of tribal thinker. I do these individualistic interpretations influenced by Mircea Eliade and Paul Tillich, right? So I kind of also get Peterson, but if you look at the bigger picture of what were the consequences of Peterson not taking a stand, in making perfectly crystal clear to everybody what he means when he's speaking from the Christian tradition. The consequences were many people were introduced, many people who formerly were secular were introduced to Christianity, to the whole thing, to the club. And then when Jordan Peterson let the whole thing loose, the dynamic itself won over the more maybe interesting interpretations that Peterson came up with. Those became basically meaningless because they didn't change the overall conventional Christian culture, which is based around these terms having very specific meanings and these terms being understood by everyone. And this is how culture functions generally, right? I mean, when you go to a new culture, you have subcultures, that's true, but still there is something like a common culture which everybody can understand. So even in Bulgaria here, we have so many beautiful subcultures, and yet we have something like a common culture, a center of gravity, which everybody, even those who participate in the subcultures, still understands. And the participants of the subculture, of course, make fun. They poke fun at the dominant mode of discourse. But they can only do this by still at least understanding what the dominant mode of discourse is. So they need to understand the jokes, they need to understand what are the things that people find important, what are the things that people find beautiful, and yada, yada, yada. So there is at least this act of recognition, of recognizing what is the dominant mode of discourse, and what are the pluralities of different perspectives that you can also take, that are also possible. And by Jordan Peterson refusing to respond in a direct manner and to distinguish perspectives as perspectives, he was refusing to recognize them. He was refusing to recognize the conventional Christian position and then see where you can get from there, from the differences that you have with that. And instead was himself using highly crude categorizations like, oh, what did he call them? The liberal, atheist, Marxist types. Like, what the hell are you talking about, Mimi? I mean, this is like, one time you say you don't want to categorize people, and the other time you put like entire populations together in a silly category. Doesn't make sense. So to get back, when I was calling you an atheist, I was not trying to categorize you, but I was trying to show that from a specific point of view, from a specific perspective, you are closer to being an atheist than you are to being a conventional Christian. So in other words, I want to emphasize two things. I want to emphasize the integrity of your own perspective, how it's different from other perspective and how it matters as a perspective. And I want to emphasize the importance of the other perspective, the perspective of the conventional Christian, because here again, I think it's important. That perspective matters as a perspective, and it needs to be recognized. It needs to be seen first before we can get anywhere else. So again, my intention was not to categorize here. My intention was to break up rigid categorizations, which I believe have to be happening in the case of John Vervaeke, for example, because how otherwise would he come to the conclusion that Sam Harris is an idiot? I mean, he didn't use the term, but he was behaving like, oh my God, this guy I don't want to talk with, right? for you to have such a strong, not you specifically, Jordan Waking this in this context, for someone to have such a strong emotional reaction towards someone, they must have categorized that person. There's just, I don't see any other possible way. There must be a process of categorization already happening and being in place. And my point has been all the time that yes, we all do this all the time. It's inadvertently a part of being human that we also are tribal. And tribal felt sense of proximity towards someone, feeling like you're close to someone, like you're committed to someone, I would say is triggered by categorizations. I think both are connected. I don't see how you can have that. I don't see how it can be possible that you experience someone to be close without categorizing them as trustworthy and putting some category out there. So what I'm emphasizing is the importance of recognizing this in us. We're doing this all the time, and mostly unconsciously. And my example with John Verwicki was exactly that. I think John is unconsciously categorizing Sam Harris as someone who has the propositional attitude, and has a specific attitude towards Islam and yada, yada, yada. He's not owning that categorization, and he's not looking at Sam Harris as someone who has a differentiated position depending on the perspective you're coming from, right? So to bring this home, I have to go back to my Wilberian integral roots. In Wilberian language, Wilber 1, like the Wilber spectrum of consciousness, he was very much like highly allergic to categorizations. In his earliest book, the idea was that categorizations are the thing that actually that kicks you out of the Garden of Eden, right? Categorizations, dual distinctions are the thing that gets you is the stuff that actually gets you out of the Garden of Eden. The later Wilber changed his position here, and what he said is, look, distinctions are not only an essential part, you can't but categorize as a human being, but distinctions are the thing that make the communal experience of feeling close to someone and the tribal experience possible in the first place. And if you don't own that and find self-aware forms of categorization, so not to abolish categorization, but do it in a self-conscious manner, in the sense that you know where your categorizations are coming from. If you don't do that, you will still live out your tribal impulses, but you will do it in an unconscious manner by being basically the tool of an egregore. So the thing that is steering your emotions and steering your attachments and commitments is not something that you have realized and are conscious of, but it's something that is coming from the outside world, which then controls you. And this is exactly what I saw in John Verwicki, in this example that I've been using all the time. The fixation of having to frame Sam Harris in a very specific manner, I think made John incapable of seeing that you can, coming from a different perspective and asking very concrete questions, like I did in the beginning in this video, if you ask all those questions one by one, you actually figure out that, hey, the individual position that Sam Harris is taking is much more aligned with my own base perspectives that I'm taking on these issues. Then it is aligned with people who stand really very, very far apart from me. Like for example, William Craig Lane. I think there are worlds between William Craig Lane and John Verwicki. So for me, it was the kind of weird situation in which John is not seeing his own allies by being unconsciously categorizing the world, while on the conscious level, what he's trying to do, I'm avoiding all categorizations. I'm here, right? I'm trying to not be in the propositional attitude, right? No, the propositional attitude is absolutely essential in creating a sense of tribal belonging and the sense of connecting with somebody else. So we can either do it in a stupid way and let it happen by itself and steer us, or we can own it and find ways of opening it up where you see it's just inadequate. It just doesn't make sense. And in this vein, I think this is the really only way I see forward. Because what you described, that, I don't talk to those 90% of people who are not part of this small circle of us who have this different reading of Christianity and those global world religions, I don't understand what then the term dialogical would even mean in this context when we're saying that we're not going to talk to those people. Well, my personal experience with this was At some point in life, after studying philosophy, I just left the philosophy bubble and I worked as a truck driver. I cleaned toilets. I was what do you call it? To put newspapers to homes with migrants, with Indians and with Pakistani people. I've worked with different minority groups, and I had to go outside of my own bubble, and I had to figure out everything that made me a good progressive and made me a good philosophy student, made me a horrible truck driver. Like everything that's good in one social context kills you in a different social context, right? You have to learn a very different kind of culture. You have to value very different things if you want to survive in a different environment. So my cosmopolitanism was not actually induced or driven by integral theory, which I had read before I went out into the world. Integral theory had created its own bubble, but my cosmopolitanism was actually most induced by just going out there in the world and talking to people who are different than I am. And then this, of course, is a very intense experience of friction. You feel like a failure all the time. You start understanding that you can't understand everything, but in many cases you have to embody and enact attitudes if you want to participate in a culture. You can't just think about it. You can't just do the theorying part, right? You're just theoria is like the standing back and the observation part, but you have to jump into it and do it. And it feels horrible. It's particularly at the beginning, it's a nightmare. And it feels like it's ripping apart your identity. But I think this is the only way if you want to get to something like cosmopolitanism. I mean, cosmopolitanism is not I'm sitting at home and I'm reading about the world and I'm trying to figure out to think properly about the world. I don't think that's cosmopolitanism. It includes everything. It includes all domains of existence. Again, my integral priming would actually mean that, well, you learn to fight as well. Well, you learn to participate in different cultures, in different styles, in different modes of thinking, and it's always a challenge. It's always painful. And someone who's representative of that for me, for example, is Socrates. And Socrates didn't just observe; he went to war. He literally went to war. He literally gave his life. That for me is a cosmopolitan attitude. So it's not like I'm observing here and I'm looking and I'm always standing back. I don't know. So again, I forgot the point I wanted to make. The point I wanted to make was the way forward for me, the really dialogical, is not to get together like John Vervaeke, for example. He got together with his friend Mastro Pietro, something of these terms, the Kierkegaard scholar, right? And he was pretending this is dialogical and yada yada. It was not dialogical because both people already share a world frame, right? They already come from different world spaces. That's not dialogical. I mean, that's dialogical. I mean, I have no problem talking to my friends. That's easy. It gets interesting when you start talking to people who are really, really radically different, who come from a different world space. And there you can't just talk to each other. Talking to each other won't get you anywhere. The thing again, which Charlie Kirk did, is absolutely pointless. It is pure propaganda for me. It's a form of narrative warfare that has been doing actually, right? If you want to get somewhere and truly include somebody who is different from you, just talking won't do the job. I don't believe in the Habermasian. Partly I believe, but I don't believe in some of the general assumptions of the Habermasian standpoint that with arguments we can get somewhere. No, if you're not sharing worlds, the arguments will have very different meanings. They will come from very different frames. The arguments won't get you anywhere. If your starting point, and our starting point today in this world is we're coming from different world spaces. If your starting point is that, the first thing we need to do is to recognize the distinctions. Not like Jordan Peterson, right? You use conventional Christian terminology to become part of the group, to become part of this huge movement, and then leave it to forces that are absolutely destructive to take over the whole thing. You don't do that. What you do is you flesh out the distinctions as clear as night and day and make them as clear as possible. You witness them, you presence them, you point to them and show them how they're different, and yet you stick together. You don't walk away. You stick together with them and see where can you get from there. And one thing you can do is look at those distinctions and ask yourself, how do I get to my perspective? This is the traditional approach of applying reason, right? You ask yourself, how did I come to my perspective? But require the other person to also authentically ask the question about themselves. What made me frame an issue the way I do frame the issue? Only this can get us somewhere. Just talking, just having a dialogue and be friendly to each other and being nice and pointing out on what we agree on won't get us anywhere. The self-deconstruction is an essential part. And if both parties are not willing or capable to do the self-deconstruction and to break out narrow categorical terms like atheist, theist, and look inside and ask specific questions like, how do you experience that, or how does God manifest for you? What do you experience in certain situations of suffering? What kind of role does God take? These are the specific questions that actually embody the whole thing, create a human connection and around which you can build something. And that was my initial intent. Again, I was not trying to frame you as an atheist, but I was trying to point out that breaking up those frames and looking at the perspectives that are involved and seeing them as distinct is the necessary beginning point for any form of transcendence and any form of inclusion and any form of synthesis. And you see that exactly this didn't happen with Jordan Peterson. The lacking differentiation, making clear of distinctions, the resulting fog of narrative warfare had as a result that the most radical positions took over the entire movement. So all the people that were drawn in by Jordan Peterson, who made the stuff so interesting, right? It's so much more exciting than the traditional, conventional Christian version. All those people who were drawn in were now drawn into a movement that is basically ready for war. And that's a nightmare. I think this is the result that we get when we don't consciously categorize. And avoiding categorization is not to not categorize. It's still to categorize, but not be conscious of how you get to your categories. I talk a bit long, I'm sorry. But I feel we just have so different understandings around these terms that I hope this was in some way constructive.